Step into the shadowy world of deception, where billions vanished behind a polished smile and a promise too good to be true. This gripping exposé unravels the infamous Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme, a financial illusion that fooled the world. From the staggering betrayal of investors to the gaping lapses in SEC oversight, we trace the ripple effects of shattered lives, relentless recovery efforts, and the reforms born from the wreckage. More than a tale of fraud, this is a sobering reflection on trust, greed, and the urgent need for integrity in the heart of finance. Buckle up. It's a story you won't soon forget. Welcome to Corrupt Roots, where money, power, and scandal collide. If you're fascinated by the dark side of Wall Street, Ponzi schemes, insider trading, and the most notorious financial crimes in U.S. history, you're in the right place. Every week, we uncover the twisted truths behind the biggest white-collar scandals, from boardroom betrayals to billion-dollar frauds. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share with fellow true crime fans. Drop a comment below to let us know your thoughts, and tell us what cases or topics you want us to dig into next. Because corruption has deep roots, and we're digging them up one case at a time. Now, back to the exposé. The Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme stands as an unprecedented case of financial fraud, remarkable for its scale, longevity, and the regulatory failures that enabled its continuation. Over several decades, Bernard L. Madoff defrauded investors of an estimated $65 billion through a meticulously crafted illusion of legitimate investing, the largest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history. This report examines the mechanics of the fraud, Madoff's exploitation of trust, the lapses of the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC), and the widespread harm to victims, including charities, celebrities, retirees, and financial institutions. It also reviews ongoing asset recovery efforts and the regulatory reforms prompted by the scandal. At its core, this analysis underscores how deception, psychological manipulation, and systemic oversight failures allowed such a massive fraud to unfold, leaving a lasting scar on the financial world. Once a respected Wall Street figure and former chairman of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange, Madoff executed his scheme through securities fraud and money laundering, fueled by greed and control. His method followed the classic Ponzi model: promise consistent returns and pay early investors with money from new ones. The scheme collapsed in December 2008 during the global financial crisis, when Madoff could no longer meet a wave of investor redemptions. He was arrested and in 2009 sentenced to 150 years in prison, where he died in April 2021 at age 82. This exposé offers more than a chronological account. It provides an in-depth analysis of the fraud's operational structure, the psychological factors behind its longevity, the regulatory blind spots, and the complex impact on victims. It also considers the broader economic lessons and post-crisis reforms, serving as a comprehensive resource for understanding this landmark case. A key insight from the scheme's collapse is the connection between fraud and macroeconomic conditions. Though Madoff's deception lasted for decades, it unraveled amid the 2008 financial crisis. As markets plunged and investor anxiety spiked, redemption requests surged to about $7 billion, far exceeding the $300 million Madoff had on hand. This liquidity crunch made the fraud unsustainable. The episode illustrates how economic downturns often expose hidden frauds by choking off the new capital such schemes depend on. It also reveals the pro-cyclical nature of financial corruption, where recessions act as stress tests that uncover systemic vulnerabilities. Another critical takeaway is the distinction between perceived and actual losses. While the commonly cited figure is $65 billion, this was based on the fictitious account balances Madoff reported. Whistleblower Harry Markopoulos estimated that roughly $35 billion of that amount represented fabricated profits. In reality, actual losses, the money invested and never returned, are estimated between $13 billion and $19.5 billion. This distinction is crucial to understanding both the psychological toll on victims, who believed they had accrued wealth that never existed, and the legal complexities of recovering funds that were never real beyond the initial capital. A Ponzi scheme is fundamentally a fraudulent investment operation where the perpetrator pays returns to earlier investors with money taken from later investors, rather than from actual profits generated by any legitimate business activity. Named after Charles Ponzi, who executed a similar scheme in the 1920s, these ploys typically involve bogus claims of underlying investments, with very few, if any, actual physical assets or financial investments existing. The scheme inevitably collapses when the flow of new investor money slows or ceases, making it impossible to meet promised returns and redemption requests from existing investors. Madoff's scheme followed this classic pattern, ultimately bursting in 2008 when the global economic decline led to a surge in withdrawal requests that he could not fulfill. A critical element in Madoff's ability to sustain his fraud for decades was the existence of a legitimate market-making business that operated alongside the fraudulent investment advisory arm. This legitimate brokerage operation was very real, handling large trades for institutional investors and even pioneering electronic trading capabilities that contributed to the formation of NASDAQ, where Madoff served on the board of governors. The Netflix documentary, Madoff, The Monster of Wall Street, highlighted the stark contrast between the modern and pristine operation on the 19th floor and the relic and shop-worn 17th floor, where Madoff was running his investment advisory business and where most of the fraud was orchestrated. This dual structure provided a powerful veneer of credibility and respectability that was uncharacteristic of typical Ponzi schemes, which are often based entirely on non-existent businesses. This allowed Madoff to operate his fraudulent activities in plain sight, making it significantly more challenging for both regulators and investors to detect the underlying deception. The legitimate business acted as a highly effective smokescreen, lending an air of authenticity that was crucial to the scheme's remarkable longevity. The reality, however, was a complete fabrication. Madoff never invested any of the $65 billion entrusted to him. No shares were ever bought or sold on behalf of his investors. The monthly statements clients received, purportedly reflecting these complex trades and consistent gains, were entirely falsified. Academic analyses conducted after the scheme's exposure confirmed that Madoff's reported returns were mathematically implausible for a legitimate split-strike conversion strategy, lying well outside their theoretical bounds and exhibiting an almost linear growth that should have immediately raised suspicions. Madoff's strategy of claiming a proprietary investment method was a deliberate and effective control mechanism. Clients were explicitly told that the investment strategy was confidential and would not be disclosed. Furthermore, Madoff was highly secretive, consistently refusing to allow outside performance audits. This deliberate lack of transparency, coupled with the complex-sounding split-strike conversion strategy, served to deter detailed inquiries from investors and auditors. It fostered an environment where asking too many questions was implicitly discouraged, often perceived as a breach of trust or an indication of an investor's lack of sophistication, thereby creating a powerful barrier to due diligence. This approach demonstrates how Madoff weaponized complexity and secrecy, exploiting information asymmetry to prevent independent verification of his non-existent trades. The perceived secret sauce of his strategy was, in fact, a carefully constructed excuse for a complete absence of legitimate operations. The very consistency of Madoff's reported returns, which attracted so many investors, was, in hindsight, the most glaring red flag. Madoff purported to deliver consistent 10% annual returns for decades, a feat that is widely considered unrealistic, if not impossible, in legitimate financial markets. Analysis revealed that negative returns were reported for only 7 months out of the entire scheme's duration, representing a mere 4% of the time. As one expert noted, no Major League Baseball hitter bats .960, and no money manager is up 96% of the time. Harry Markopoulos, the whistleblower, further underscored this, concluding that Madoff's consistent 1% a month return was atypical for a split-strike conversion strategy, and mathematically impossible given the extremely low correlation between Madoff's reported returns and the S&P 100 index. This consistent, almost linear growth of investments points to a fundamental flaw in investor perception: the pervasive desire for low-risk, high-return investments often overrides critical thinking and skepticism about plausibility. It starkly highlights the importance of recognizing the too-good-to-be-true principle and understanding that all legitimate investments inherently involve risk. To entice and reassure investors, Madoff claimed to employ a sophisticated investment strategy known as split-strike conversion. He promised clients that their funds would be invested in a basket of common stocks within the Standard & Poor's 100 index, with these positions hedged by buying and selling options contracts to limit potential losses from unpredictable stock price changes. He also claimed to opportunistically time purchases and intermittently invest client funds in U.S. government securities like Treasury bills. To maintain the elaborate charade, Madoff established a broad infrastructure designed to create and support the impression of a legitimate, actively trading investment advisory business. This infrastructure was responsible for generating an extensive volume of false and fraudulent documents, including fabricated monthly client account statements and trade confirmations. Key personnel were instrumental in this deception. Annette Bongiorno, Madoff's longtime bookkeeper, played a central role. She would research old newspaper editions to identify the best-performing stocks from the past month, then invent the number of shares an investor had supposedly bought and record fictitious gains on client statements. David Kugel, a legitimate bond arbitrage expert Madoff hired, provided details of his actual trades. These details were then used to create a facade of legitimate activity for the Ponzi scheme. Even though no actual investments were made, the fraudulent operations were meticulously segregated from Madoff's legitimate market-making business. Strict internal rules ensured that only a select few individuals had access to the Ponzi accounts, and these accounts never communicated with the firm's legitimate business operations. Client accounts were also carefully monitored to ensure that if clients knew each other and compared statements, the fabricated numbers would generally align, preventing immediate suspicion. To further enhance the illusion of global trading activity, Madoff strategically moved money from his New York-based business to a London-based entity, Madoff Securities International Limited, MSIL, thereby creating the false appearance of conducting securities transactions in Europe. While Bernie Madoff was a pioneer in electronic trading and instrumental in the development of NASDAQ, the core of his Ponzi scheme's fabrication relied on manual, almost artisanal deception. Annette Bongiorno's role, for instance, involved researching old editions of the newspaper to make up a number for how many shares the investor had bought and record the gain. This starkly contrasts with the sophisticated, high-speed electronic trading that characterized Madoff's legitimate market-making operations. This manual falsification of records and statements was a critical, labor-intensive component of maintaining the scheme's illusion for decades. This situation suggests that even in highly digitized and technologically advanced financial environments, the human element of trust and the meticulous, often manual, creation of fraudulent documentation can sustain large-scale deception, particularly when regulatory oversight is insufficient and primarily relies on self-reported data. Madoff also ingeniously leveraged an exclusivity model as a psychological barrier to scrutiny. To join Madoff's investment advisory business, investors were typically required to deposit at least $1 million and maintain a minimum balance of the same amount. This policy, coupled with Madoff's practice of sometimes initially turning away prospective clients, deliberately fostered a sense of exclusivity in the financial community and made it a mark of prestige to be admitted as a Madoff investor. This created a powerful form of social proof. If others, particularly those perceived as successful or well-connected, trusted him, then why should new investors question his methods? This psychological tactic effectively discouraged critical due diligence, as potential investors might fear losing access to this seemingly privileged and highly sought-after opportunity if they appeared too inquisitive. This aspect of the scheme offers a significant lesson in how perceived scarcity and social validation can powerfully override rational financial scrutiny. The longevity and scale of Madoff's scheme were not solely the work of one individual. A network of key individuals and entities with varying degrees of knowledge and complicity played crucial roles in enabling the fraud. Annette Bongiorno, as Madoff's long-serving bookkeeper, she was directly involved in fabricating the fictitious client statements based on historical market performance. Her manual efforts were central to creating the illusion of legitimate trading. Frank DePascali, a senior executive at Madoff's firm, DePascali was deeply embedded in the fraudulent operations. He was among the first to be told by Madoff, "I'm out of money," just before the confession. DePascali, like Madoff and others in the inner circle, enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, owning multiple luxury assets, indicative of the personal enrichment derived from the scheme. David Kugel, initially a legitimate bond arbitrage expert, Kugel's expertise was exploited by Madoff. Kugel provided details of his legitimate trades, which Madoff then used to create a facade of activity for the Ponzi scheme. Critically, Kugel did not object when he discovered the truth and continued to share his trades, profiting from the results, and was allowed to set his own salary, becoming a multi-millionaire through the scheme. Feeder funds. These were investment management funds that aggregated money from numerous other investors and channeled it directly into Madoff Securities for management. These funds earned substantial fees for their role, often without individual investors realizing their money was ultimately being managed by Madoff. Many feeder funds reportedly ignored red flags, choosing profits over due diligence, effectively funneling new capital into the scheme and lending it an additional layer of credibility among their own client bases. The roles of these individuals and entities illustrate a spectrum of complicity and unwitting enablement that extended the scheme's reach and longevity. Madoff's inner circle, such as Bongiorno and DePascali, were directly involved in the fabrication of records and the daily maintenance of the fraud. David Kugel's situation, however, highlights a more passive yet still enabling form of involvement. While he provided legitimate trading information, his acceptance of the fraudulent use of this information and his continued personal gain demonstrate a willingness to overlook the illicit activities. Feeder funds, on the other hand, while perhaps not directly fabricating records, played a crucial role by neglecting their due diligence responsibilities and continuing to channel new money into the scheme, effectively lending it an air of legitimacy to their own clients. This collective behavior suggests that the Madoff scheme was not merely the product of a single individual's deception, despite Madoff's initial claims of operating alone. Instead, its remarkable scale and duration were facilitated by a breakdown of ethical boundaries and a pervasive self-interest. across multiple layers of the financial ecosystem. This points to a systemic problem where individuals and institutions, either through active participation, willful blindness, or negligence, contributed to the perpetuation of a massive fraud. Bernie Madoff possessed a remarkable ability to cultivate trust, a cornerstone of his decades-long deception. He strategically built close friendships with wealthy and influential businessmen in prominent social circles, notably in New York City and Palm Beach, Florida. These relationships were then leveraged as their positive recommendations served to attract a steady stream of new investors. Madoff meticulously crafted a front of respectability and even generosity, actively impressing investors through his involvement with and support of various charities, many of which ironically became his victims. His firm's strict investment requirements, such as a minimum deposit of $1 million and a $1 million minimum balance, were not merely financial hurdles, but deliberate psychological tools. These rules fostered a powerful sense of exclusivity and prestige within the financial community, making it a mark of prestige to be admitted as a Madoff investor. Madoff often initially turned away prospective clients, further enhancing the perceived desirability and scarcity of access to his funds. This created a strong social proof phenomenon. If prominent and discerning individuals trusted him, then others felt little reason to question his methods. Madoff's strategic use of social proof and affinity fraud was highly effective. He actively cultivated close friendships and relied on positive recommendations to attract more investors. A particularly insidious aspect of his strategy was targeting members of the Jewish community, leveraging his own prominence within it to gain trust. This tactic, known as affinity fraud, exploits shared characteristics or community ties to establish a deep sense of trust that bypasses traditional due diligence. The implicit endorsement from a trusted peer or community leader often acts as a powerful substitute for independent verification, making potential investors less likely to scrutinize the underlying investment. This approach reveals how fraudsters can skillfully manipulate social capital to create insulated ecosystems of trust, where external warnings or logical inconsistencies are easily dismissed. It underscores that even highly sophisticated investors can be vulnerable when strong social connections and a sense of shared community override professional skepticism and critical financial analysis. The consistent, unrealistic returns Madoff reported were, paradoxically, a major red flag that was frequently overlooked. His fund reported positive returns 96% of the time, a performance virtually unheard of in legitimate markets. While the principle of too good to be true is a fundamental warning sign in finance, many investors ignored this intuition. This can be attributed to a powerful form of cognitive dissonance. The desire for high, consistent returns, especially in volatile markets, outweighed rational skepticism. As psychological research suggests, when individuals are presented with information that perfectly aligns with their desires and expectations, they are less likely to question it compared to information that contradicts their beliefs. Madoff further reinforced this by subsidizing investors in down months, only booking winning tickets in their accounts and eating the losses, thereby ensuring a consistently positive appearance for client statements. The Madoff case profoundly illustrates how human cognitive biases can be expertly manipulated. Investors, driven by a combination of greed and a yearning for financial security, either actively or passively disregarded inconsistencies that would, in a rational assessment, have been glaring red flags. This highlights the persistent challenge for regulators, financial educators, and individuals to counteract these deeply rooted psychological vulnerabilities, emphasizing that even sophisticated investors are susceptible if a fraudulent scheme is expertly tailored to their desires and exploits inherent psychological shortcuts. An examination of Madoff's personality reveals a complex interplay of traits that contributed to his criminal enterprise. Madoff himself described his ambition as a driving force, stating, "I built my confidence up to a level where I felt that there was nothing that I couldn't attain." He frequently rationalized his actions as a slippery slope, initially convincing himself that his transgressions were merely a temporary situation and that he would eventually correct course. He admitted to a lack of self-control, acknowledging that he allowed himself to continue taking in more money, perpetually waiting for market conditions to change and rescue him from his predicament. Post-scandal analyses, including studies examining Madoff's actions against established psychopathy scales, suggest he embodied a range of psychopathic traits. These included superficial charm, a profound lack of sincerity or truthfulness, a strong tendency to cheat, emotional shallowness, and a striking absence of remorse for his victims. He was reportedly known for bullying detractors while meticulously cultivating an image of rationality and competence for those whose opinions mattered to his business. Even during his incarceration, Madoff consistently displayed no remorse for the immense suffering he inflicted upon his victims. The progression of Madoff's criminal behavior presents a complex psychological profile, moving from what he described as an accidental initiation to a deeply ingrained pattern of deception. Madoff claimed the scheme began opportunistically, driven by a fear of failure, when his legitimate arbitrage strategies became less effective due to market changes. He characterized the fraud as a mundane series of errors, one leading to another, rather than a premeditated grand design. This narrative suggests an initial slippery slope from a legitimate business person to a fraudster. However, the decades-long perpetuation of the scheme and his consistent lack of remorse, as observed in later analyses, strongly suggest a profound shift towards a psychopathic disregard for others. This apparent progression from initial rationalizations to a more entrenched pattern of deceit raises fundamental questions about the point at which opportunistic transgressions solidify into genuine criminality. It also highlights whether certain personality traits, when combined with unchecked ambition and ample opportunity, can inevitably lead to large-scale, devastating deception. The Madoff case thus underscores the inherent difficulty in detecting such traits within high-pressure financial environments, where confidence, risk-taking, and a relentless pursuit of success are often not only tolerated, but actively rewarded. The Madoff scheme serves as a compelling case study in how inherent human cognitive biases can be exploited in large-scale financial fraud. Investors, even those considered sophisticated, were often inherently trusting and, critically, overconfident in their own ability to detect deception. Several cognitive biases played a significant role in investors' susceptibility. Confirmation bias led individuals to selectively seek out or interpret information in a way that confirmed their existing belief in Madoff's legitimacy, causing them to ignore or downplay any warning signs that contradicted this belief. The halo effect also contributed, where Madoff's established reputation and perceived success in his legitimate market-making business led investors to assume his trustworthiness and competence extended to his investment advisory arm, without adequate scrutiny of the latter. The longevity of the Madoff Ponzi scheme is inextricably linked to a series of profound and repeated failures by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. Despite investigating Madoff's firm off and on since 1992, the SEC consistently missed numerous red flags and failed to act decisively on credible complaints. Between 1992 and 2008, the agency received at least 6 substantive complaints that should have triggered serious scrutiny of Madoff's operations. 1992, Avellino and Bienes investigation. The SEC's first significant interaction involved Avellino and Bienes, an unregistered investment firm suspected of running its own Ponzi scheme. The SEC discovered that all of Avellino and Biene's investments were channeled through Madoff, and that these investments consistently yielded returns with no reported losses. Despite these clear indicators, the SEC narrowly focused its investigation on Avellino and Bien's for selling unregistered securities, rather than thoroughly scrutinizing Madoff's central role or the possibility of a larger fraud. Madoff, aware of the investigation, frantically ordered his staff to falsify 3 years of financial statements to match Avellino and Bien's paperwork, which was off by over $100 million. The SEC's lead examiner at the time acknowledged that tracing the funds would have been common sense to uncover a Ponzi scheme, but no such effort was made. Harry Markopoulos, a financial analyst and whistleblower, submitted an 8-page analysis to the SEC's Boston District Office, explicitly questioning the legitimacy of Madoff's reported returns and directly stating that the entire fund is nothing more than a Ponzi scheme. He highlighted Madoff's perfect market timing ability and his refusal to allow independent audits as major red flags. Subsequent examinations by the SEC's Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations, OCIE, in 2004 and 2005, despite being triggered by complaints raising broad concerns about Madoff's trading and returns, were narrowly focused on front-running. Examiners did uncover suspicious information and caught Madoff in contradictions, but these concerns were either disregarded or Madoff's implausible explanations were accepted at face value. A critical letter drafted to the NASD, an independent third party seeking independent trade data, which experts believed would have revealed the Ponzi scheme, was never sent. An enforcement investigation initiated during this period was assigned to a team with limited to no experience in conducting Ponzi scheme investigations. Attempts to obtain crucial documentation from European counterparties, which could have exposed the fabricated international trades, were abandoned. The consistent failure of the SEC to detect the Madoff fraud, despite numerous warnings and internal inconsistencies, can be attributed in part to the powerful reputation shield that Madoff successfully cultivated. Madoff's prominence within the financial industry and his perceived connections significantly influenced SEC examiners and investigators. The agency was described as being enamored by Madoff's reputation and exhibiting an inherent bias towards the sort of people who are seen as reputable members of society. This predisposition led regulators to look the other way and dismiss red flags that would have warranted aggressive investigation for a less established figure. Madoff actively leveraged his stature, attempting to intimidate and impress junior examiners by emphasizing his role in the securities industry and dropping names of influential SEC officials. This dynamic highlights a critical systemic vulnerability in regulatory bodies, a tendency to be swayed by reputation and perceived authority, which can lead to a reluctance to aggressively investigate well-connected individuals. This reputation shield effectively allowed Madoff to operate with impunity, transforming the SEC's oversight, however inadequate, into an unwitting endorsement of his fraudulent activities. This situation underscores the urgent need for regulatory independence and a culture that prioritizes objective evidence and rigorous scrutiny over perceived status or influence. Failure to verify information independently. A critical and consistent deficiency was the SEC's reliance on Madoff's self-provided records instead of independently verifying his trading activities through third parties. In the 1992 investigation, examiners sought records from Madoff himself, rather than directly from the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, DTC, a step that experts later concluded would have likely exposed the scheme. Requests for external trade data were drafted but never sent, or efforts to obtain documentation from European counterparties were abandoned. Fundamentally, the enforcement staff never requested Madoff's bank records to trace the movement of investor funds, a basic step in any Ponzi scheme investigation. Okay, inexperienced staff and inadequate training. Examination and investigation teams often lack the necessary expertise in complex equity and options trading, as well as specific experience in conducting Ponzi scheme investigations. This deficiency was particularly evident in the 2005 to 2006 enforcement investigation, which was assigned to a team with little relevant experience. Organizational and systemic weaknesses. The SEC suffered from a silo mentality where different offices and groups rarely collaborated on examinations. For instance, 2 parallel OCIE examinations of Madoff were conducted simultaneously by different offices without either being aware of the other, and even after communication, there was limited information sharing. This fragmentation prevented a holistic view of Madoff's operations and the aggregation of red flags. Furthermore, the absence of formal policies for handling tips and complaints, coupled with pressure to complete a high volume of examinations annually, contributed to projects being delayed, pushed aside, or left incomplete without proper closing reports. The silo mentality and lack of inter-office communication within the SEC significantly fragmented investigations and prevented a holistic view of the pervasive fraud. The fact that 2 parallel OCIE examinations of Madoff were conducted simultaneously by different offices without either knowing about the other meant that critical pieces of information and red flags were never consolidated or analyzed collectively. Even after Madoff himself informed one team about the other ongoing examination, there was relatively little sharing of information. This institutional compartmentalization allowed Madoff's scheme to persist by preventing a comprehensive assessment of his activities across different regulatory touchpoints. This organizational dysfunction highlights a crucial lesson for regulatory bodies. Effective fraud detection requires integrated, cross-departmental communication and a unified approach to investigations, rather than isolated efforts that can be more easily circumvented by a sophisticated fraudster. Academic analysis of the Madoff fraud has also highlighted the inadequacy of a purely disclosure-based regulatory philosophy in increasingly complex financial markets. The prevailing regulatory approach, which often relies on companies and financial entities to disclose accurate information, proved insufficient when faced with a meticulously fabricated system like Madoff's. As the Madoff case demonstrated, even with formal disclosure requirements, the lack of rigorous, independent verification and a deep understanding of complex financial strategies by regulators can render disclosure ineffective. Love the dark side of Wall Street, Ponzi schemes, and financial crime? You're in the right place. We uncover the biggest white-collar scandals every week, from billion-dollar frauds to boardroom betrayals. Like, subscribe, and share with fellow true crime fans. And drop a comment to tell us what you want us to dig into next. Corruption runs deep, and we're exposing it, one case at a time. Now, back to the expose. This situation suggests that in an environment characterized by information asymmetry, where one party, the perpetrator, possesses significantly more knowledge than the other, investors and regulators, a regulatory framework solely dependent on self-reported disclosures is inherently vulnerable. The Madoff scandal underscores the need for regulatory bodies to evolve beyond mere disclosure oversight towards more proactive, technically informed, service approach and verification-intensive investigative approaches to effectively combat sophisticated financial crimes. The SEC's failure to uncover the Madoff Ponzi scheme was not merely a series of isolated errors, but symptomatic of deeper systemic deficiencies within the agency. These included inadequate analysis and narrow focus. SEC staff repeatedly dismissed credible allegations, failed to comprehend fundamental Ponzi scheme indicators, and maintained an overly narrow focus in their investigations. Despite complaints raising broad concerns about Madoff's trading and returns, examinations were often confined to specific, limited issues like front-running, rather than addressing the overarching fraud allegations. Inconsistencies were disregarded, and Madoff's implausible explanations were often accepted without sufficient challenge. Perhaps the most glaring illustration of the SEC's regulatory failures lies in its repeated dismissal of the detailed and persistent warnings from whistleblower Harry Markopoulos. Markopoulos, a forensic accounting and financial fraud investigator, famously concluded as early as 2000 that Madoff's investment advisory business was the world's largest Ponzi scheme. Markopoulos's complaints, particularly his 2005 submission titled "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud," meticulously detailed approximately 30 red flags. These included the mathematical impossibility and consistent nature of Madoff's returns, which were atypical for his claimed split-strike conversion strategy. He pointed out that Madoff's fund reported positive returns 96% of the time, a statistical anomaly. Markopoulos also highlighted the suspicious lack of extensive paperwork for over-the-counter trades, the ease with which Madoff as a broker-dealer could manufacture trade tickets, and the extremely low correlation, 6%, between Madoff's reported returns and the S&P 100, which he deemed mathematically impossible. Furthermore, he calculated that there were simply not enough OEX index put options in existence for Madoff to be hedging his investments as he claimed, concluding that Madoff would have to be over 100% of the total OEX put option contract open interest. Markopoulos also questioned Madoff's unusual secrecy and lack of publicity for such a supposedly successful fund. Despite the specificity and technical depth of Markopoulos's analysis, the SEC's enforcement staff expressed immediate skepticism and disbelief. They discounted his evidence, partly because he was not an insider or investor, and questioned his motives. Markopoulos himself testified to Congress that the SEC's failure to act was due to a lack of financial expertise, insufficient staff, and internal rivalries between regional offices, asserting that the agency was over-lawyered, has too few staff with relevant industry experience and professional credentials to find fraud, even when a multi-billion-dollar case is handed to them on a silver platter. The dismissal of Harry Markopoulos's technically sophisticated and detailed analysis, primarily due to his outsider status and the SEC's internal lack of expertise, represents a critical breakdown in regulatory effectiveness. Markopoulos, an expert in financial fraud investigation, provided concrete, mathematically supported evidence that Madoff's reported returns were impossible to replicate and indicative of fraud. Yet his warnings were met with skepticism and disbelief, partly because he was not an insider or an existing investor in Madoff's firm. This situation highlights a profound organizational deficiency within the SEC, a potential over-reliance on traditional investigative methods, and an insufficient appreciation for external, specialized expertise, particularly in complex financial products and strategies. The agency's internal talent pool reportedly lacked the necessary experience in equity and options trading and Ponzi scheme investigations. This gap in technical proficiency meant that even when presented with a silver platter of evidence by someone with the requisite knowledge, the SEC was ill-equipped to understand, verify, or act upon it. This failure underscores the imperative for regulatory bodies to cultivate deep internal expertise, foster a culture that values external whistleblowers, and develop robust mechanisms for evaluating complex financial anomalies regardless of the source of the warning. For decades, Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme thrived by continuously attracting new investors whose capital was used to pay purported returns and redemption requests to earlier clients. However, this precarious balance was shattered by the onset of the 2008 global financial crisis. As Wall Street collapsed, firms merged or went bankrupt, and the stock market plummeted daily. Investors worldwide became increasingly anxious and sought to withdraw their funds from various investments. Madoff's firm, unlike others, continued to report consistent gains, averaging 1% a month, which initially reassured some investors. However, the widespread economic downturn prompted a surge in redemption requests that Madoff could no longer meet. While the paper value of client accounts stood in the billions, Madoff's investment advisory business had only approximately $300 million in the bank to cover $1.5 billion in requested withdrawals. This liquidity crisis, the death knell for any Ponzi scheme, forced Madoff to frantically seek a cash infusion, but he found no one willing to invest. On December 3, 2008, Madoff confessed to his key associate, Frank DiPascali, "I'm out of money." A week after confiding in DiPascali, on December 10, 2008, Madoff held the firm's annual Christmas party and distributed early bonuses. Later that day, his two sons, Mark and Andrew, who had grown increasingly concerned about the firm's operations, confronted him at home. It was then that Madoff apparently revealed the truth to his sons and wife for the first time. "I'm running a Ponzi scheme, and we're out of money." Mark and Andrew immediately cut ties with their father and mother, left the house, and contacted an attorney, who in turn informed the SEC. The following day, FBI special agents visited Madoff at his home. When confronted about the accusations, Madoff confessed directly, stating, "There is no innocent explanation. I've been running a massive Ponzi scheme." He was arrested shortly thereafter. Madoff initially insisted he operated the scheme alone and would not testify against anyone, though subsequent investigations revealed the involvement of others. On March 12, 2009, Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal felony counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, perjury, and money laundering. On June 29, 2009, he was sentenced to the maximum allowed, 150 years in prison, with restitution of $170 billion. He was transferred to a federal correctional complex in North Carolina, where he died in April 2021 at the age of 82. While Madoff initially claimed to have acted alone, subsequent investigations led to the prosecution and conviction of several of his associates, who received varying sentences. These included key figures like Frank DiPascali and Annette Bongiorno, whose roles in fabricating records and supporting the scheme were central to its operation. The Madoff scandal also had a devastating and tragic impact on his immediate family. His two sons, Mark and Andrew, who worked for the legitimate side of the firm and reported their father to authorities, faced immense public scrutiny and legal battles. Mark Madoff, overwhelmed by the betrayal, public condemnation, and financial uncertainty, descended into deep depression. He died by suicide on December 11, 2010, the second anniversary of his father's arrest, found hanging from a pipe. Andrew Madoff later died from lymphoma in 2014, 6 years after the scandal broke. Ruth Madoff, Bernie's wife, also faced significant repercussions, forfeiting $80 million in assets as part of the settlement, retaining only $2.5 million. The profound personal tragedies within the Madoff family highlight the far-reaching and destructive consequences of such a massive fraud, extending beyond the direct financial losses to inflict severe emotional and psychological tolls on all connected. The Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme inflicted widespread devastation across a diverse spectrum of victims globally. These included prominent charities, high-profile celebrities, numerous retirees, and sophisticated financial institutions. Among the well-known victims were actors Kevin Bacon and Kyla Sedgwick, DreamWorks Animation CEO Jeffrey Katzenberg, actor John Malkovich, Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel, who lost his life savings of $12 million and $15 million from his foundation, and broadcaster Larry King, Zsa Zsa Gabor, and Steven Spielberg's Wunderkinder Foundation also suffered substantial losses. Many victims had known Madoff for years, even decades, viewing him as a trusted friend, which deepened the sense of betrayal. While the estimated fraud amount is widely cited as $65 billion, it is crucial to distinguish between fictional and actual losses. The $64.8 billion figure represents the total balance in Madoff's 4,800 client accounts as of November 2008, including fictitious profits that were never actually invested or earned. Harry Markopolos estimated that at least $35 billion of this claimed amount never existed. Being purely fabricated profits, the actual cash losses, representing the nominal cash amounts investors paid in and did not subsequently withdraw, amounted to admitted claims of approximately $19.5 billion. Other sources suggest the actual loss to investors was over $13 billion. This distinction is vital for understanding the true financial impact and the complex nature of recovery efforts, as funds cannot be recovered if they never existed in the first place. Given that no legitimate investments were made on investors' behalf for at least the last 12 years of the scheme's operation, the recovery process has proceeded on a money-in, money-out basis. This principle dictates that investors are entitled to receive no more than the nominal cash amounts they originally paid into the scheme and did not subsequently withdraw, without any consideration for inflation, interest, opportunity cost, or the false profits Madoff reported to them. This approach aims to restore victims to their original principal investment, rather than compensating them for the fictional gains they believed they had accrued. This legal doctrine, known as fraudulent conveyance in bankruptcy proceedings, also meant that investors who withdrew more money than they invested, net winners, could be compelled to return their profits or even part of their initial investments to ensure equitable distribution among all victims. Beyond the staggering financial losses, the Madoff Ponzi scheme inflicted a profound and widespread psychological and emotional toll on its victims. Many lost not just their life savings and retirement funds, but also their fundamental sense of security and trust in financial systems. The consequences were varied and severe, including intense distress, depression, physical health problems, and even suicide attempts. One victim's investment advisor, after learning of his own family's losses, was in a state of total shock, highlighting the ripple effect of the betrayal. Some victims reported that the stress accelerated the deaths of their spouses. Victims often experienced feelings of shame, guilt, and a loss of self-esteem. Many attempted to hide their victimization from their social circles or avoid reporting the fraud to authorities, fearing social condemnation. The prevailing attitude that victims deserve their losses due to greed and stupidity further intensified their shame and led to social isolation. This blaming the victim phenomenon created conflicts in interpersonal relationships and exacerbated the victim's own negative emotional responses. For many in Madoff's primarily Jewish client base, the betrayal was particularly deep, as their trust was rooted in living memories of ancestors who had lost everything during the Holocaust. Madoff's exploitation of these community ties through affinity fraud meant the betrayal left deep scars, tearing families apart and leaving communities struggling to recover. The Madoff scandal serves as a stark reminder that the impact of fraud extends far beyond monetary figures, profoundly affecting the mental, emotional, and social well-being of those targeted. The recovery of funds for Madoff's victims has been a monumental and complex undertaking, spearheaded by two primary entities: the court-appointed trustee, Irving Picard, and the Department of Justice's Madoff Victim Fund, MVF. Since December 2008, Picard and his legal team at Baker Hostetler LLP have been diligently locating and seizing assets for distribution to investors. Picard was granted broad powers by U.S. District Judge Lawrence McKenna to seize assets, records, demand documents, summon witnesses, and enter Madoff's residences globally. The MVF, administered by the Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Section, MLARS, of the Justice Department, has played a critical role in compensating victims directly from forfeited funds. Their efforts involved reviewing millions of pages of documentation and hundreds of thousands of financial transactions. Alongside extensive communication with victims, over 820,000 calls or emails to help them navigate the petition process. The MVF's direct payment model ensures that for every dollar paid out, a victim receives a dollar, maximizing efficiency. Asset recovery efforts have focused on seizing Madoff's personal wealth, his firm's assets, and, controversially, funds from net winners or feeder funds through clawback lawsuits. Madoff and his wife Ruth agreed to forfeit significant assets. Madoff forfeited his share of $170 million in real estate, investments, and other assets, while Ruth forfeited $80 million, retaining $2.5 million. Their combined net worth was estimated between $823 million and $826 million, including a $7 million Manhattan penthouse, an $11 million Palm Beach mansion, and a $1.5 million French Riviera apartment. These properties and other valuables, including jewelry and watches, were seized and sold by federal marshals. Trustee Picard pursued the legal doctrine of fraudulent conveyance, compelling investors who withdrew more money than they initially invested, aka net winners, to return those profits. Letters were sent to 223 investors with direct ties to the Madoff family, seeking the return of $735 million, redeemed up to 6 years before the collapse. Notable clawback actions included lawsuits against feeder funds like Fairfield Greenwich Group and Harley International, Cayman Limited, which invested billions with Madoff and withdrew substantial amounts, alleging they ignored warning signs. Recovery from the estate of deceased Madoff investor Jeffrey Pickauer, which contributed approximately $2.2 billion to the victim fund. A deferred prosecution agreement with J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, N.A., resulted in an additional $1.7 billion in civil forfeiture. Funds were also recovered from investor Carl Shapiro and his family, and from other Madoff co-conspirators. The recovery efforts have yielded substantial results, providing a nearly full recovery for a significant number of victims. As of March 2025, the trustee, Irving Picard, had recovered $14.7 billion towards claims through legal actions, making 16 distributions to investors. The Department of Justice's actions recovered an additional $4.3 billion. The Madoff Victim Fund, MVF, has made 10 distributions, with the 10th and final distribution of over $131.4 million completed recently. These payments have brought each participating victim to an impressive 93.71% recovery from all sources. Cumulatively, the MVF has paid over $4.3 billion directly to 40,930 victims across 127 countries. Notably, nearly 10,000 victims eligible for the final distribution had received zero compensation from any source other than the MVF, highlighting the fund's critical role as a lifeline. The MVF is set to complete its work in 2025, marking the culmination of a decade of intensive effort to compensate victims of this monumental fraud. The Madoff Ponzi scheme served as a stark and painful catalyst for significant legislative and regulatory changes, as well as a reevaluation of best practices for investors and financial institutions. The scandal exposed profound vulnerabilities in financial oversight and underscored the critical importance of vigilance. In direct response to the Madoff scandal and the broader 2008 financial crisis, Congress enacted the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act in 2010. Among its numerous provisions, Dodd-Frank significantly amended the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 by adding Section 21F, which established a robust securities whistleblower incentives and protection program. This program was specifically designed to incentivize individuals to come forward with original information that leads to successful enforcement actions and recoveries from alleged fraudsters. Under this program, whistleblowers who voluntarily provide original information leading to enforcement actions with total monetary sanctions exceeding $1 million may receive an award ranging from 10% to 30% of the collected sanctions. The SEC also established an Office of the Whistleblower to administer this program, allowing whistleblowers to submit tips anonymously if represented by counsel. This initiative aimed to rectify the SEC's past failures to act on detailed complaints, such as those from Harry Markopolos, by providing a powerful financial incentive and a protected channel for reporting fraud. Since its inception, enforcement actions brought using whistleblower information have resulted in orders for over $6.3 billion in total monetary sanctions, including over $4.0 billion in disgorgement of ill-gotten gains, demonstrating the program's success in combating Ponzi schemes and other financial frauds. The Madoff scandal delivered critical lessons for both individual and institutional investors, emphasizing the imperative for rigorous due diligence and skepticism. Key takeaways include independent due diligence. Investors must perform their own rigorous due diligence and not rely solely on reputation or word of mouth, even from trusted friends or community members. Madoff's ability to cultivate trust through friendships and exclusivity proved to be a powerful, yet misleading, endorsement. Questioning red flags. Investors must be acutely aware of and react to warning signs or red flags. Promises of unrealistic or consistently high returns, particularly those that appear immune to market fluctuations, are a clear warning sign that should prompt immediate skepticism. Skepticism of exclusivity. Investment pitches that emphasize exclusivity or limited access should be viewed with extreme caution. Madoff's strategy of requiring high minimum balances and selectively admitting clients created an aura of prestige that deterred critical inquiry. Demand for transparency. Investors must demand transparency and ask detailed questions about investment strategies, underlying assets, and how returns are generated. If an investment strategy is proprietary and cannot be disclosed, or if the details are not explained clearly, it is a significant red flag, and investors should walk away. Diversification. The importance of diversifying not only assets, but also money managers, accounts, and financial institutions was underscored. Victims who were financially stable after the Madoff scam were those who had invested only a percentage of their assets with him, not their entire life savings. Auditor scrutiny. Investors should scrutinize the auditor of any investment firm. The fact that Madoff's purported auditor was a small, unknown, hard-to-locate firm with only 3 employees despite managing billions should have been a red flag. The Madoff scandal highlighted broader systemic issues within financial market oversight and ethical conduct. It exposed a culture where ethical lapses at multiple levels, from feeder funds prioritizing profits over due diligence to regulators failing to act on clear warnings, enabled the fraud to flourish. The ease with which Madoff created a broad infrastructure to generate false documents and transfer funds internationally to create a false appearance of legitimate transactions underscored the need for enhanced global regulatory cooperation and robust anti-money laundering measures. The crisis also prompted a reevaluation of the psychology of white-collar crime, particularly the role of ambition, rationalization, and psychopathic traits in perpetrating large-scale fraud. It emphasized that such crimes are not always the result of a single, premeditated master plan, but can evolve from a series of small transgressions on a slippery slope. This understanding informs efforts to identify and mitigate risks associated with unchecked ambition and a lack of accountability within financial institutions. Ultimately, the Madoff case serves as a powerful reminder of the continuous need for robust regulatory frameworks, proactive enforcement, and a strong ethical compass across all participants in the financial system to prevent future catastrophic frauds. In conclusion, the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme remains a defining event in financial history, a testament to the devastating power of unchecked deception and the critical vulnerabilities within financial markets and regulatory systems. The scheme's unprecedented scale, estimated at $65 billion in fictional liabilities and over $19 billion in actual losses, was sustained for decades by a masterful blend of Madoff's cultivated charisma, an aura of exclusivity, and a meticulously fabricated investment strategy that promised unrealistic, consistent returns. This intricate deception was further enabled by a small, complicit inner circle and a broader network of feeder funds that, through negligence or self-interest, channeled vast sums into the fraudulent enterprise. The scandal exposed profound and systemic failures within the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, which repeatedly missed glaring red flags and dismissed detailed warnings from whistleblowers like Harry Markopolos. These regulatory shortcomings stemmed from inadequate investigative practices, a narrow focus, a reluctance to independently verify information, a lack of specialized staff, and an institutional susceptibility to Madoff's formidable reputation. The inevitable collapse, triggered by the 2008 financial crisis, unleashed a wave of financial ruin and profound psychological distress upon a diverse global victim base, highlighting the far-reaching human cost of such crimes. Despite the immense challenges, the subsequent asset recovery efforts, led by trustee Irving Picard and the Madoff Victim Fund, have achieved remarkable success, recovering billions and compensating over 40,000 victims to nearly 94% of their actual losses. This unprecedented recovery stands as a testament to the dedication of legal and governmental efforts to right a monumental wrong. The Madoff legacy extends beyond restitution, driving significant regulatory reforms such as the Dodd-Frank Act and the SEC Whistleblower Program, designed to enhance fraud detection and prevention. The case serves as an enduring cautionary tale, underscoring the vital importance of rigorous investor due diligence, a healthy skepticism towards promises that appear too good to be true, and the imperative for financial institutions to uphold the highest ethical standards. Ultimately, the Madoff fraud is a powerful reminder that perpetual vigilance, robust regulatory oversight, and an unwavering commitment to transparency and accountability are indispensable for safeguarding the integrity of global financial markets against the insidious threat of large-scale deception. And that's a wrap on today's dive into deception, dollars, and the dark side of finance. If this story shook you, shocked you, or made you question just how deep corruption runs, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a twist in America's most infamous financial crimes. Share this episode with fellow true crime fans and drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and what cases you want us to cover next. Until next time, stay sharp, stay skeptical, and remember, even the strongest empires can have corrupt roots.